the first initial question that I have, and then we can unpack a bit more all of the situation and, of course, get deeper into the Israeli-Palestinian war. Why did they fire you? Why was this such a revealing truth, and why was it counter to the macro American system, and of course to UPenn? University of Pennsylvania is such a prestigious university.
Right. So your questions are very good, because and I think they're helpful as a next sort of a chapter of this, because the model that people have and most people have in their heads. Okay, so first of all, let me backtrack a little bit. I want to talk about how we get our models, because that's a very important question. So we get our models of the world through the media, because we don't have direct contact with the world, right? So none of us is what you witness directly is almost nothing. So you have a few interactions with your friends, with your family. You know, the world you see when you're driving around in your car or walking in your neighborhood. There are a very few things that you do witness personally and directly, but that's it. Almost everything you believe about the world, even about your own city, almost everything you believe is true about what's happening in your own city, it all comes to you through the media. What's happening in Russia, what's happening in Israel, China, India, Mexico, the US, anything, it's all the media. So the media constructs your reality. And therefore, if the media has been saying that the United States government is the biggest ally of Israel, and you hear academics everywhere, in every university, repeating this, if you hear supporters of Israel saying it over and over again, and you hear enemies of Israel saying the same thing over and over again, and you hear the governments of both countries, the governments of every country, but also the government of the United States and the government of Israel, you know, all of them saying that the United States is the biggest ally of Israel. Well, then that becomes your model. It becomes your geopolitical model, right? Why? Because you have no other access to reality, unless you start doing historical research like I did. But most people have no inclination, time, or energy to do any of that, or even the skills a lot of the time. Although I think citizen journalism is proving that these skills can be developed relatively quickly. It's not nuclear physics. All citizens can start doing this, and they should. So the model you have in your head is the model that the media puts in your head. So what I'm saying is very surprising if your model is that the United States government is the biggest ally of Israel. Now, when you get evidence that dramatically contradicts that, then you have to search for a different model, one that will be consistent with the facts. And so that's what I started doing. The first thing I started doing is I started looking into the entire history of U.S. foreign policy towards Israel. And I have a little ebook published in my old website, which is still available as an archive. It's called Historical and Investigative Research. So I published there a book, an ebook, that traces the entire history of U.S. foreign policy towards the Jews and then towards Israel. And I was then able to see the pattern, and the pattern was not one of alliance. The pattern was one of the United States consistently doing important stuff to weaken the security of the Israeli state, while claiming all the time in public that they were supporting the Israeli state, right? So that began to open my eyes even more. I was like, oh, okay, well then this is consistent with not telling people who Husseini is, pretending that PLO Fatah has changed its colors, and inventing a diplomatic process to bring PLO Fatah into Israel, and threatening Israel, because they threatened Israel with the removal of U.S. aid, military and financial, if Israel didn't participate in the Oslo process to bring PLO Fatah into Israel. All of that happened, right? So in the context of this larger history that I was now researching, it became clear to me that this was consistent. It made sense that the U.S. had a consistent pattern of undermining the security of the Israeli state. And then I discovered Edwin Black. thanks to Jared. Jared is the guy who got me to read Edwin Black, and Edwin Black had written a book called War Against the Weak. War Against the Weak is one of the most important books ever written in all of history, in my opinion. It's definitely for the understanding of modern history, because Edwin Black resurrected from oblivion a subject that is most important. Just like Husseini, the same thing that happened with Husseini, where for decades they stopped talking about him, right? And then it disappeared from the consciousness of democratic citizenry in the West. Everybody just forgot about Husseini because the media didn't mention him, right? The same thing happened with eugenics. So eugenics was not a secret when it was happening. It was an open thing. It was a gigantic international movement. It was especially big in the United States. It was biggest in the United States for a long time, until Germany overtook it. But eugenics was a gigantic U.S. phenomenon. And this is important because eugenics is the original ideology of the alleged biological superiority of Germanic peoples. That's what eugenics is. And it had a whole pseudoscientific apparatus behind it. So huge fortunes were spent raising the prestige of certain biologists and psychologists and social scientists and so forth who were defending this idea. And it was dressed up in pseudoscience. So what they would tell people is that the poor people were poor because they were stupid, because they had bad genes. Rich people and powerful people were rich and powerful because they were smart, because they had good genes. These are the people that started using IQ tests to diagnose the intelligence of people and so forth. It's a big fraud. It's a big scientific fraud. The program was to use these IQ tests to, quote unquote, prove that people in the lower classes had lower intelligence because they had bad genes, and justify with that quote unquote diagnosis horrific things like putting people in special prisons that they called colonies for epileptics and feeble-minded until their reproductive period was over, which for men is until they die. Or they would sterilize them, forcibly sterilize people so they couldn't reproduce. Or they separated people who were married. They did horrific things. And hundreds of thousands of people, according to Edwin Black's documentation, were treated this way in the United States, in the United States, in the first half of the 20th century. And there were gigantic, these big monopolists, the biggest industrialists in the United States were financing this. The people like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, and others were sinking just billions of dollars into this. So all of this was happening in the United States, and the same people who were promoting this in the United States were exporting it internationally, and a lot of this money was going to Germany to make German eugenics flourish. The German eugenicists were learning everything from the Americans. So one of the things that your listeners should know is that the Nuremberg laws of 1935 were modeled on the legal developments in the U.S., where everything had been done first. So the Nuremberg laws of the Nazis in 1935 are the laws that are the backbone of the entire T4 project, which is when they began carting off people they considered inferior into concentration camps. This is not yet extermination of the entire Jewish people. That was not happening yet, but they were certainly carting off certain categories of people to concentration camps with those laws, and those were modeled after what had been achieved in the United States. So once you put all of this context together, and you realize that the people in Great Britain and the United States who were at the very top of the power structure were devotees of the same ideology that we associate with Adolf Hitler, right? So eugenics is the parent movement that produced German Nazism. It was one of the quotes of Edwin Black's book. He says it ended up in Auschwitz, but it started in Long Island, or something like that. It's the other way around. It started in Long Island, ended up in Auschwitz, because the American eugenicists, with Andrew Carnegie's money and Rockefeller's money and so forth, they created a gigantic complex in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and they were collecting statistics about all kinds of stuff about Americans, U.S. citizens, to find out, who was going to be oppressed, who was going to be put in jail, and who was going to be forcibly sterilized, and all this stuff. So that's where Nazism comes from, and once you understand that, the post-war behaviors of the U.S. power elite towards Israel are easier to understand. It becomes less of an aberration because your model is now changing. Now you can see, oh, I see. So the people running the United States in the first half of the 20th century had a movement that is basically the same ideology as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and they were actually supporting the growth of that in Germany, sending money, and they were controlling the U.S. government, right? They got the U.S. Supreme Court in 1924 to approve forced sterilization, and those same people put Roosevelt in the White House. The Rockefellers were quite instrumental in supporting Roosevelt's presidential campaign, and of course they were very powerful. They were doing this out of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Once you adopt this other model, of course, new questions come into view which need to be solved. So, for example, one obvious question is, well, then what was World War II, right? Because there was a declaration of war between the United States and Germany. So what about that, right? And that means that you need to start looking into the details of the war, which I did. I now have an entire book series on this. But just not to make the story too long, one of the things you need to look again at when you start changing your model is appeasement. And in this narrative, Neville Chamberlain and the earlier rulers of Britain and Daladier in France and even Roosevelt in the United States are represented as innocents. So they were not too smart in this narrative. They didn't understand Hitler well enough, or in time. They were too stubborn, didn't want to believe that this guy really meant what he said, and they were also cowardly. So when at opportune moments, they could have stopped Hitler with a very small cost, relatively small cost. But they were too timid, they didn't act in time, they were not forceful enough, and they developed a policy of trying to see if they could make Hitler happy by giving him the things he wanted and thus appeasing him. This is where the word comes from, appeasing him, and in that way avoid a general war, right? So this is the narrative that emerges. This is what we all learn in school. Appeasement was a big mistake. These people were idiots. They were cowards. When you read carefully this narrative, it cannot explain anything. Peter, this doesn't make any sense. Just look at what they did. They gave Hitler, they allowed him to build submarines. They allowed him to reoccupy the Rhineland. They allowed him to, swallow Austria and then kill Czechoslovakia, and so at every juncture, and I'm giving you the big ones, there are also smaller details, and at every little or large juncture where the Western leaders made a decision that ended up helping Hitler strategically. If you're an astronomer, say, you're interested in the movements of heavenly bodies, and you have a theory of these heavenly bodies, right? You have a model of how they're supposed to work. And as you look at their movements and you chart their trajectories, you keep saying to yourself, well, that the moon shouldn't be there. What's Mars doing over there? Wait a minute. What, the comet? You mean the comet goes from here to here? Well, that's absurd. That doesn't make any sense. If that's the way you're talking about the heavenly bodies, what it means is that you have a terrible model. You don't understand gravity. You don't understand how these bodies relate to each other, right? When you have a good model, you stop talking like that. Everything suddenly makes sense. Well, of course it's going over there, but my equations predict that it should go over there. And yeah, the moon is doing this because the Earth is over here and the sun is pulling it and so forth, right? When you have a good model, the puzzles disappear. That's the whole point of having a good model. So the fact that Scheider and every other historian of World War II talks about appeasement as something that is inexplicable means that they're simply wrong. They have the wrong model of what was going on. Now, when you substitute this model that they gave us, where Western leaders who had to deal with Hitler were supposedly idiots and cowards, you replace it with the model that says, no, they were not appeasing Hitler. They were promoting Hitler. Right? These were eugenicists. Once you understand that they're eugenicists, you can start imagining that everything they did was policy rather than a bunch of mistakes that somehow miraculously always went in the same direction of assisting Hitler's conquest, right? Brett Weinstein has a lot of discussions of this topic. He often says 0 is a special number, right? And that's a useful phrase, because if pretty much everything they're doing helps Hitler, then it's not random. Random mistakes go in different directions. But this was appeasement was a very consistent series of policy decisions that all ended up helping out Hitler, right? So, I mean, people are not that stupid. Stupidity doesn't get you that. That's not incompetence. That's competence, right? So then you have to switch your model of their intentions, and then everything makes sense. Once you know that they were eugenicists. So Neville Chamberlain, this is the clincher for me in the appeasement story. Neville Chamberlain, who is the poster child for appeasement. If you're only going to say one thing about appeasement, if you have only 2 words to talk about appeasement, you will say Neville Chamberlain, right? Is the poster child. Well, turns out Neville Chamberlain was a major eugenicist. So he keeps being represented as this bumbling fool, this idiot who didn't understand anything. Come on, man. Neville Chamberlain was the most powerful man on earth. And he didn't inherit the job, he won it. Neville Chamberlain became prime minister of Great Britain when Great Britain was ruling the world. You think that guy is an idiot? Neville Chamberlain was considered a god by the aristocrats who crowded around the Conservative Party of Britain. He was an alpha male. And historians have documented that Neville Chamberlain, this was documented in the 1980s, although, of course, you'll never hear about this in the media, but it was documented by academic historians at Oxford and Cambridge. Their investigations were published in the best historical journals. It was documented that he had the entire British press on a short leash through the clandestine services of the British Secret Service, MI5 and MI6. They had the whole British press became a clandestine monopoly controlled by Neville Chamberlain through his best friend, Joseph Ball. So they were managing our reality, right? They had the entire press. The same thing was happening in the United States. Rockefeller, who was another eugenicist, one of the most important ones, had a whole, this was documented by historian Christopher Simpson, another key historian that everybody should read. Christopher Simpson wrote a very important investigation called Science of Coercion, where he documents how the Rockefeller network was taking over the press in the 1930s. They had this gigantic program to study psychological warfare, how to use the media to manage the reality of U.S. citizens, right? So this was, and they were corrupting, they were allied with CBS and everybody else, and they were corrupting the U.S. press. So once you put all this context together, appeasement looks very, very different. It looks like a plan that was put into place to fool Western citizenries, make them believe that Western leaders were opposed to Nazism because they had to do that simulation. Otherwise, there would have been revolutions in the West, because obviously ordinary Western citizens, great multitudes of them, were very afraid of the Nazis and viscerally opposed. So the Western leaders had to pretend to be enemies of the Nazis, but what they were doing in terms of policy is very different. Now, of course, that opens a new question, which is, well, what about the war declaration? Because eventually they did go to fight with the Nazis and so forth, and that also needs to be answered by a full model. And I have answers to all of those questions. I've put them in my book. I believe I have a relatively complete model of what happened now. Yeah. But anyway, this is the process. So every time you explain something, you notice something else that doesn't quite fit, well, then you need to go look at that and learn more until you produce a model where it does fit. Because eventually, your theory has to explain everything. There can be no paradoxes, okay? So if you have a model where you have some important paradoxes, that means you're not finished. You got to keep working. And when you have a model where pretty much everything that happened is a paradox, which is the original story that they've been telling us about World War II in school, right? Which is Scheirer and Churchill. If everything that happened is inexplicable, then you are completely wrong, and you need to start rethinking everything you think you know.
Wow. I have to take a deep breath, because it's a bit overwhelming to hear you, Francisco, in the sense that there are many paradoxes in my mind. There is